if it's good for you, yeah. So let's start. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming to the first meeting that we are organizing in the framework of the Sciences Po Europe Alumni Group, with the idea that this event is obviously concerning lots of people in Europe, and it's an interesting time to rethink lots of our premise on what should we do in Europe, what are the main what have we missed, in a sense, about what was at the root of the Russian aggressiveness against Ukraine, and that will be the topic of tonight, the political economy of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. And I think that we have decided with Florent, Francesco, and the group Joanna also to start maybe something such as a cycle on Ukraine and in this framework, with the idea that it's a topic which will last for a long time. We all hope that tomorrow will be the day of the ceasefire, but even if the ceasefire is tomorrow, I would say the day after, or maybe the very second just after the ceasefire, we will have to win peace, and not only to be satisfied with the fact that it's just the ceasefire. And having this in mind, I think it's important to like have an understanding on how things can work out, and that's the idea about the cycle. I have already worked, and we have worked collectively with the Europe group of the alumni to see. To bring different perspectives to the debate. Tonight, we are very lucky to host Sergei Guriev, who is famous for lots of things. First of all, because he's probably one of the most famous Russian economists of the time, and it's interesting to hear you for many reasons, because as a Sciences Po fellow, we are all proud that you came to France, but also because previously you've been the chief economist at the EBRD, which is something which has let you, observe lots of things in Europe and in the post-Soviet space. You have also been, the rector of the new economic school in Moscow, and even before that, and it's very linked to the subject. You have been a high school diploma of the Kiev Physics Mathematics High School. So it shows that you have an understanding both of the, I would say, of what happened in the Russian circles in which decision-making was made at some point, the evolution of the Russian regime, maybe, and the Putin governance, which probably has evolved at some point, and we probably missed some of the thing, and it would be fascinating to hear you about that, because we'll have many questions and many open questions yet. And also maybe it would be interesting to hear you about the True Russian initiative that you've launched. So there are many reasons, to listen to you. And I suggest that we start, and I let you the floor, maybe for an introduction or a speech of, well, let's say 30 minutes, and then so that we can have some question and answers. Sergei.
Thank you, Florent. I will not speak for 30 minutes. I'll be shorter, but indeed I will tell a story of the reasons behind this aggression. It's actually 2 weeks after, hard to understand why Mr. Putin has done that, because it definitely has damaged his regime. It destroyed Russian economy, undermined his credibility, not just in the world, but also among close friends, his entourage. Even if they share the view that Ukraine should be destroyed, they now are disillusioned that he's built a system which cannot destroy Ukraine in that way. And so we need to understand why and how this happened. So the overall evolution of Putin's regime has been long. He came to power first as Mr. Yeltsin's prime minister in mid-1999, in August 1999. And actually, he was fortunate in that way that that was the lowest point of Russian economy. So ruble was cheap, unemployment was high, a lot of spare capacity, oil prices low and only started to grow. And when he came, Russian economy started to grow, and the subsequent growth was associated with his name. And for 10 years, Russian economy has done extremely well. And Mr. Putin's popularity was high because Russians saw unprecedented growth of incomes and wages. So GDP per capita doubled in 10 years, and Russians saw their real wages corrected for inflation, tripling. Unemployment went down by half, poverty went down by half. Russia paid off its debt, which was supposed to be a problem. Russia started to accumulate money in the reserve fund, stabilization fund first. So Russia has become a completely different country. Part of the explanation was higher oil prices. Oil prices have grown a lot. Part of the explanation was the low initial point. Part of the explanation was the reforms of 1990s that started to provide benefits a bit later. Some of the reforms Mr. Putin continued in his first term, and they also paid off. So the first 10 years were a really good time. And if Putin stepped down in 2008 and just left, he would be probably one of the most popular Russian politicians ever. Now, was he honest, democratic politician in those years? The answer is no. By now, we know that he started building his Black Sea Palace already in the first day in office. So basically, he called oligarchs and said, you will import medical equipment and there'll be a kickback of 35%, which you need to donate to this foundation. So that started right away. He also right away started his assault on media freedom. He harassed the independent TV channel NTV right away, and media freedom started to shrink. The space for political opposition also started to shrink right away. So yet he was very popular, and he would be winning elections even without censorship and targeted repression, because the economy was doing so well. Now, however, as corruption was growing, as his political system became more and more centralized, the state started to dominate the economy. There were nationalizations. The economic growth was losing steam. And once Russian economy went to crisis and recovered from crisis, by about 2010-11, the growth started to slow down dramatically. And so in 2013, growth was already 1%. So Mr. Putin saw how economy is slowing down, but also how his popularity is coming down. So that is very important. In years before 2013, his popularity ratings, approval ratings, have actually come down quite a bit. They were still like at 60%. It's not low, in a sense that if Russians were asked by pollsters, do you approve of Mr. Putin? 60% would say yes. Yet it was much lower than before. And so Mr. Putin was looking for new sources of legitimacy. And after Euromaidan, Revolution of Dignity, he saw this opportunity to grab Crimea, which he used and which worked amazingly well for him. His popularity ratings went through the roof, from 60 to 85 or even 90. And that really something that he probably didn't expect himself as well. But this is something that transformed his way of viewing the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. So then after that, his popularity rating started to come down again, because economy was not growing, economy was stagnating, Russians' incomes were coming down, not up. So before the war, real incomes of Russian households, so incomes corrected for inflation, would be below 2013's level by 5 or 10%. So it's a huge problem for Putin. So it's not surprising that his popularity rankings were coming down. And then also, despite censorship, opposition was growing more popular because opposition was using YouTube, and Putin didn't know how to stop YouTube. Now, internet censorship started already in 2012, and it was increasingly tight, but still, YouTube was breaking through, and not surprisingly, Alexei Navalny became a #1 problem for Mr. Putin, which resulted in his poisoning in 2020 and then imprisonment in 2021. So yet, that was not the end of the story. So Mr. Putin was thinking how to bring back his popularity, and he was looking for another Crimea. And again, he saw that the West is not as strong as United before. US has extreme polarization. January 6 events suggested to many within the Kremlin that the West may actually be going, at least US may be going for a civil war. He also saw divisions between US and Europe, the brain death of NATO, statements by President Macron, discussions of strategic autonomy, refocusing of US on China rather than Europe, and of course the exit from Afghanistan. So he thought it's again an opportunity to grab some piece of neighboring country, come back with victory, and be popular again. And so that is something that now, 2 weeks later, sounds like a really, really bad idea. But dictators, they're not crazy, but they're not informed. So in many cases, dictators suppress media freedom and freedom of debate and end up in a situation where they're surrounded by yes men. And they only get to read information which is prepared for them by people who are afraid to stand up to the dictators. And so Mr. Putin had an over-optimistic view of Russian army, over-optimistic view of Ukrainians' support for Mr. Putin, and he thought it would be an easy war which would end in a couple of days. So the plan was probably to capture Kiev, replace the government with a puppet regime, put non-NATO status in the constitution, and recognize independence of Donetsk and Lugansk and annexation of Crimea. So that is a set of conditions. They also added denazification, which probably meant that Mr. Putin would go after those nationalistic battalions like Azov. So that was the plan. And the plan may have worked if Putin captured Kiev for 2 or 3 days, but it didn't. Now, I should say that even if Putin captured Kiev in one or 2 days, that would be followed by an insurgency, not unlike the insurgency in Afghanistan in Soviet times. Ukrainians don't like Russia. Ukrainians will be supported by the West, and in that sense, that would still be a costly decision. But what is most important, this is completely speculative because Ukrainians put up a fight, and even now Kiev is not captured, not even encircled. Now, I would warn anybody from saying that the war is over and Russia is permanently stuck. We don't know what happens when Russia learns from the mistakes and regroups, but it is true that in the last several days, there is very limited progress of Russian troops. We seem to overestimate Ukrainians' successes because Ukraine is winning informational war, except for informational war within Russia, where Putin completely shut down independent media. But because Ukrainians are so effective in social media and the media, and there is a loss of compassion to Ukrainians, we may actually think that they're doing better than they are. They're definitely fighting bravely and resolutely, but that may or may not be enough. The war is not finished yet. Anyway, so that is the story about the mistakes. Part of the decision-making process's problem was that Minister Putin wanted to make this decision in secret. And so he limited the circle of people who make the decision to a very small group. And for example, economic policymakers had no clue that the war would actually start. Foreign Affairs Ministry had no clue and was not prepared. And you can see by the reactions of those policymakers after the war has started that they were completely unprepared. They thought that it's brinkmanship, that Putin would stop with recognizing independence of Donetsk and Lugansk and use the concentration of troops just as a threat. So this independence would be easier to establish. But they were wrong. Sanctions were strong and catastrophic for Russian economy, and that's where we are now. Now, the other political economy question is always, so what? Will that result in the regime change? So in a democracy, an economic shock like this would result in resignation of pretty much everybody in the government, including the president. but this is not a democracy. And Mr. Putin has several tools in his sleeve that allow him to stick to power. Russians are very unhappy, but if Russians take to the street, Mr. Putin now has invested in the repression apparatus that helps him to beat up the peaceful protesters, and we saw that in recent couple of weeks. Second, Mr. Putin, after the war has started, shut down all independent media and criminalized dissent. So today, if you write a post that Mr. Putin's war is not going according to official version, that's actually a crime, criminal punished by up to 15 years in jail. So that is also an explanation why Russians are scared to talk about those things on social media or even when they're asked by the pollsters. The second thing is unhappiness of the elite. Oligarchs are extremely unhappy. All businesses are extremely unhappy. Their companies are now at the verge of bankruptcy. Some of the best Russian companies are in technical default. So Yandex is actually in technical default. So some of the companies are in real default because without imported inputs and capital and without access to finance, some of the companies will just not survive. And so situation is very bad for Russian businesses, but they cannot do much because Mr. Putin told them that he will go after them if something happens. So it's very hard to overthrow Mr. Putin either through mass protests or palace coup. He is thinking about those issues all the time. He plays divide and rule, and he does have loyal security services. So this is where we are. On the other hand, there is a growing discontent even within the military establishment, because the way the war is proceeding is destroying Russia, and soldiers or officers or generals who would want Russia to win this war now blame Mr. Putin for his incompetence, and therefore may be as unhappy as they go for overthrowing him. So I would say that eventually this decision has shortened the political life of Mr. Putin a lot, destroying the economy and undermining his credibility among his entourage, as well as among Russian people. But when that results in a political change, we don't know. Now, there is one important element here. Russian currency reserves are frozen, but Russia has a flow of oil revenues. Now this flow is disrupted, but if it's and disruption comes from sanctions, but also from private sector's behavior who don't want to touch Russian oil and self-impose an embargo on themselves. So still, if Russia continues to pump oil and gets paid in full, that will actually solve all Putin's fiscal problems and also balance of payments problems. And so what is crucial in the coming days, if the West wants to stop the war in Ukraine, it's important to introduce oil embargo. And the sooner and the broader this embargo is, the faster, the sooner the war finishes, or at least is frozen, and the ceasefire starts. So that's where we are, and I'm happy to take your questions now.
Maybe I can take one or two questions, and then we open the floor to the question. We have already some questions. Maybe just to continue on the final point you made about the question of oil embargo, and I think it's something which will be discussed in a way in European circles, and that's the thing. Would you also agree to say that sanctions shouldn't be, I would say, I mean, it's not an end in itself. It's generally something much as a means, which should help us, I mean, to reach the final goal, which is make peace in Ukraine. If we say it's like a punishment, it's less efficacious as a political tool, and what we need is a political tool in order to settle peace in Ukraine. And the thing is, especially in the European discussion, we all know when sanction starts, but do you think we should say, okay, it's over? I mean, it's an embargo forever. Or would you say that we should say, okay, we have another embargo and we keep it until the ceasefire is made to be sure that it's a political tool with which we can bargain? Or do you think it's, no, Mr. Putin is so out of reach that even this political tool is supposedly inefficient? What's your take on, should we take sanction as, I mean, an endless process, or should we put an end and say, and maybe it's more or less efficient, I don't know, well, we can stop at some point if you change your behavior?
Right.
Maybe as a first question.
Sanctions usually are introduced indeed to change behavior. So Iran says we have a nuclear program. The world says we'll impose sanctions on you. After a few years, Iran says let's negotiate. They negotiate, and sanctions are removed. Right. So we saw that in the last decade. It really works like this. Now with Mr. Putin, somewhat different. Situation somewhat different. Before the war, the West said, you invade Ukraine, we'll introduce dramatic sanctions. Mr. Putin said, what are you talking about? I'm not going to invade Ukraine. Then he lied. Actually, today it's an interesting, it was an interesting event. Mr. Lavrov, foreign minister, just said, we have not invaded Ukraine. I don't know what he meant by this, but he said, we are not going to attack any country. We've not attacked Ukraine. Anyway, coming back to sanctions. So deterrence didn't work. Then the West says, if you stop now, we will not introduce further sanctions. Then we introduce sanctions and say, if you stop now, we will remove sanctions. Mr. Putin doubles down. And now it's not about punishment. It's about depriving him of resources that allow him to continue the war. That's the idea. Basically, if Russian budget collapses, for which oil embargo is essential, you will not have money. Russia will not have money to pay soldiers and policemen. And paying policemen is really, really important, because otherwise protesters will succeed. So this is what the logic of the sanctions is: destroy Mr. Putin's economy, destroy Mr. Putin's budget, so Mr. Putin cannot sustain the war in Ukraine. And honestly, Russian economy is quite destroyed. It's now back to 1990, I would say. There is no stock market. For example, in Iran, there is stock market. There is no McDonald's, right? McDonald's came to Russia, I think, in '89. The flights to Europe have stopped, but soon domestic flights will stop because Boeing and Airbus are not serviced, and majority of Russian air fleet is Boeing and Airbus, and so on and so forth. We can continue, but the exodus of foreign companies is so dramatic that Russian economy is now increasingly reminding us the Soviet economy. So I think the right approach is to say, these are the dramatic sanctions. We introduce them so you stop the war. When you stop the war, we'll remove some of the sanctions. And then depending on the conditions of peace, some of the sanctions should stay or not. Victoria Nuland at some point said that sanctions will only be removed not just after peace, but also after reparations to Ukraine, contribution to rebuilding Ukraine, which kind of makes sense as well. So, and some of this money may actually come out of the frozen frozen currency reserves. So this is my view. Honestly, I think the outcome is more likely where Mr. Putin will not negotiate, will have a de facto ceasefire. There will be a frozen conflict, which means a lot of sanctions will stay in place, which means at some point, Mr. Putin's regime will collapse. Thanks.
Maybe I will take a couple of questions that were asked. I just mentioned it. I mean, it's on this discussion thing. Question about the national reserves, I think, which have been frozen. It's like $630 billion. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
So there is a big pile of money, 630, and some of that is in euros, some in dollars, some in yuan, some in pounds, some in Swiss francs, and some in gold, right? So we don't know how much. We only have data for half a year ago. So the way it works, they publish the data for 6 months before, and so in January they published data of last June. Last June, 13% were in yuan, 23% were in gold. right? So sounds like this portion, almost 40%, is safe. This is not actually the case. Why? Because when central bank is sanctioned, no entity will be happy to buy gold from central bank because you will get sanctions on this entity. And so in that sense, central bank may play some informal games, somehow find a shady entity that will disappear before it's sanctioned and so on and so forth. But central bank will definitely not get dollars because Americans control all the dollar flows. So it's not going to be easy. And with renminbi, with the yuan, Russian central bank has assets in China, which can be used, for example, to buy some Chinese stuff and then bring this Chinese stuff into Russia. This will also raise the risk of sanctions against whoever deals with the Russian central bank, but it will be much harder to observe. So in that sense, a lot of this bulk of money has been frozen, and in that sense, it's a huge problem.
We have a question from Olivier Marty, a good friend, an economist from Brussels, who asked about I think an FT article with Mr. Osman from Harvard, which said that putting 90% tariffs on oil and trade would be better than an embargo because it would hurt producers more. And maybe do you agree with the general idea that putting some strong taxation is better in this case than embargo, or not?
I think it's not a bad idea. I think as all new ideas, everybody says it's hard to implement, but it's not a bad idea. Right now, by the way, Russia is working with a 30% tax. Why? Because a lot of buyers just don't like to buy Russian oil. Shell and BP don't buy Russian oil. A lot of transportation companies boycott Russian oil. So Russian oil is now 30% cheaper than Brent. This is a huge gap. We've not seen this gap ever. And so that is something that therefore it's not stupid. Another thing is Russia is likely to face a tax from China if everybody imposes an embargo and China doesn't join the embargo, which is likely. It's not impossible that China de facto joins the embargo, but if China doesn't join the embargo, they will actually use it as a bargaining chip and buy oil at a lower price. So in principle, I'm not against this idea. I think a lot of oil producers will be unhappy to sell this oil to Europe, but for most oil producers, the marginal cost is actually $10 or $20 per barrel. So if you impose tax as high, you may still have a profitable transaction.
I think you have answered the question of Frank about the fact that China actually may play in terms of supporting Russian regime and take an advantage of it.
Yeah. Let me add to that. I think China is the key issue. So oil embargo and China are the two game changers. China may try to substitute Europe as a trade partner with Russia. It's not going to be easy because China doesn't possess the same technology as the West. Russian main trade partner is actually Europe with whatever 50-55% of the whole trade Russia has, while China has 10 or 15% of trade volume. So it's going to be a huge logistical challenge, and also in some cases there is no substitute. For example, Chinese semiconductors are just worse than Taiwanese semiconductors. So it's not going to be easy, but also China doesn't seem to be excited about this. And Chinese banks do comply with American sanctions. We just heard that China doesn't want to supply aircraft parts. And the reason for that is Chinese banks, Chinese companies don't want to be targeted by American sanctions. We are in Paris. Remember, there is a bank called BNP Paribas, which broke American sanctions. And about 10 or 15 years ago, it was forced to pay a huge penalty, $9 billion. So if Americans impose this penalty on a French bank, they will be very happy to impose such a penalty on a Chinese bank. So this is what it is. So
another question from Hermete Mariani on the question that is Putin as a sense of a suicide mission, and if it's a suicide mission, the question is how much hardening sanction on Russia might push Putin to take that option. I mean, maybe the question of deterrence that we evoked.
Right. So Putin strongly believes that the West is weak because the West values human life more than Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin is prepared to use nuclear strike. So I don't know. I don't know what will happen, but actually it takes several people to launch nuclear weapon, and I'm not sure that generals will stand up against Mr. Putin, but it's also not clear if Mr. Putin just launches a nuclear strike unprovoked, the generals will actually do that. We already saw that American intelligence has excellent sources within Kremlin, because American intelligence published a lot of stuff when the war was approaching. And I think that is because a lot of insiders actually think that Mr. Putin is going too far. And so I hope that it will not happen. But I cannot, of course, be confident. I should, yes, Mr. Putin doesn't want to step down, that's for sure. He knows he has nowhere to run. But he's also overconfident, so he will think that he will survive with the sanctions. And even if he is forced to stop the war, he will probably retreat to his normal life. It's just economy will be destroyed, but he will rely on propaganda and repression and hope that he will survive. Eventually, he will not. But when Russian protesters will overthrow him, or when he's arrested by generals or by oligarchs, who knows, he will not launch a nuclear strike. And if he's not provoked, if there is no war, launch a nuclear strike would be hard to do, because other people who need to turn the key will probably not follow
him. I will make a synthesis of two questions. One was linked with the NATO thing. I mean, in the sense that no, Mr. Zelensky has turned away NATO in a way which is a smart move, which tells to the Western countries, well, you know, you have abandoned me. And on the other side, I mean, by doing this is already like demanding one of the possible demands from the Russian side on NATO, which is a smart move, and it's a move toward more, I mean, towards some kind of peace negotiation. The other thing, so there's a question which is linked about the European equilibrium, is about the European Union. And we know that now the candidacy of Ukraine will be, will be under the radar, as we say in French, which means that we will, we have to consider, I mean, the candidacy of Ukraine. To what extent do you think it is something which is acceptable to the current Russian leadership? And maybe with a comparison, I remember that in 2002, 2003, I was already interested with European studies, and the thing was, Russia was very critical at that point about the EU enlargement. And in the end, they didn't complain a lot, because they realized that the economic effects of this was not the fact that people were trading less with Russia. They were still trading, and they could trade with Russia, but there was a huge increase in trades with Europe. So do you think that once NATO hypothesis is a bit further away, that European Union as a credible, is a credible option now for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think if Zelensky says we are not going to join NATO in the next 20 or 50 years, that indeed removes a huge part of Putin's narrative. And of course, for Ukrainians, safety is important. But if they win this war, which is very unlikely in the sense that they will not come back to pre-war pre-war borders unless they fully destroy Putin's army. So, but Ukrainians, of course, want safety, but they may actually accept what has happened. They will not recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. They will not recognize annexation of Crimea. If Zelensky says that, he will be impeached right away. So, yet, of course, Ukrainians care about EU a lot. And I think if Ukraine becomes a candidate country and gets a roadmap and starts reforms, that will be great for Ukrainian economy. It's also going to provide Ukraine access to many neighborhood instruments, candidate country instruments, and so for Ukrainian economy, it will be actually good. For Putin, there is no narrative that he doesn't want Ukraine to join Europe. His narrative is NATO. So yes, it may actually help. But there is, I see that Olivier is asking about no-fly zone. I'm pretty sure that Putin will use nuclear weapons. So if no-fly zone is established, Russian planes will go there, they'll be shot. At that moment, Putin will just launch a strike against the airfield where those planes are based. So that is something that Putin has said reasonably clearly. Maybe the first strike will be relatively limited in terms of number of victims, but Putin will show that he can use the nuclear strike. And what the West will do, I don't know. But the West is very clear that it doesn't want to test that, and I think you can understand that. So here we are.
Maybe well, we have a question from Francois about the use of Air Force, if you want to answer, but it's maybe more military than.
Yeah. So I told in the beginning, I told Florent that last year everybody was a virologist and epidemiologist, and now everybody's a military expert. So I'm not a military expert, and like you, I can just read articles with this title. There are plenty of articles with this title, which I can summarize as follows. Ukraine still has its anti-aircraft equipment. For example, like the one which shot Malaysian Boeing, these books, right? Which means if Russian jets are flying very high, they can be shot by this thing. But then if Russian jets fly very low, they can be shot down by Stingers. And so that's a little bit like in Afghanistan, right? Once America supplied Stingers to Afghan fighters, then Russian air superiority has disappeared. Francois is asking another question, that the war costs Russia 20 billion a day. I keep hearing this number. I don't know what the source is. I'm actually very interested to see where it comes from. It's definitely not the direct cost. It may be indirect cost in the sense that Russian market is destroyed, Russian economy is in a recession. That may be. Even that is a problem because Russian GDP is, before the war, was 1.6 billion. So 20 billion a day for 15 days is 300 billion. So that may be in terms of cost to the GDP because of devaluation. That is possible. Russian GDP in dollars is much smaller than 1.6 billion. But in terms of direct cost, no. Russian total military budget is $60 billion. There are some other things because Russia is also using police, not just soldiers. So you need to add up a lot of numbers on top of the 60 billion, but also Russia is not using the whole army it has. So it's not that bad, but it is significant in the sense that if Putin has fiscal problems, it will be much harder for him to pay everybody and keep everybody happy.
Yeah, maybe two final questions and more if it comes. I think many experts, and I'm among this, were mistaking when we consider that the idea of putting troops around Ukraine was a way to make Ukraine implement the Minsk II agreement, which would make sense in many ways. And I think that if today we have the opportunity to come back to 15 days ago, we would say, okay, vote everything, otherwise it would be a catastrophe for everybody. So there is this thing. Do you think we can see some kind of surprising peace the war was surprising? Do you think the peace will be surprising, or do you think that it will come just at a moment when Russia is sure that it can't advance more? Or do you think that we can see some kind of ceasefire, some kind of peace settlement before Russia take Kiev? But also Odessa is definitely one of the cities which is, I mean, under the, I mean, what would be the can there be a price for, I mean, a price for peace which would be agreeable for Russia before it can have some military conquest? Because that would be the question. So
I don't know. So one surprise could be if China calls Russia and says, please make peace. Then Russia will make peace, which means America should call China before and promise something to China. This is not impossible, even though this administration came to the office saying China is the biggest problem for the West, Russia is not a problem. Now it has to change that completely. We saw during World War II that the West made a partnership with Soviet Union, which was a pretty evil regime. Yet to defeat Germany, that partnership emerged. So maybe something like this happens and there will be a very quick peace. Other than that, I think Putin will continue fighting until he sees he cannot gain any more ground, and then he may just stop and he may just say, I keep Kherson, he'll probably get Mariupol, right? So I keep land bridge between Donetsk and Crimea, I control water supply, whatever he gets at that point, maybe Odessa. And so he says, I control this, I go home, I don't shoot anymore. There is no peace, but there is a frozen conflict. And he sells it as a victory back at home. Another way is to negotiate indeed non-NATO membership. But I think for Putin, it's not going to be enough because the cost of war is so dramatic. The fact that Ukraine will not recognize the independence of East Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, that means that it's not going to be sold as a big war. So he needs to grab some land, and I think he will. He already has. So this is what I would expect. Now about Minsk agreements, I fully agree with you that it was strange. In Russia, the narrative goes that Ukraine doesn't want to implement Minsk agreement, but there were offers on the table where the West would bring in international peacekeepers and control the border between Donetsk and Russia. This offer has never been seriously considered by the Kremlin. So in principle, one can implement Minsk agreements, but that depends on the order in which it is implemented. In the order preferred by Russia, where there is first an election and then we talk about the border, that is not going to work because we don't know who is supposed to vote and how you can vote if you have this warlords controlling the territory. So yes, I think Minsk agreements were dead, and Russia actually broke them first by recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Do we have time for a final question, maybe?
Yeah, okay.
Pierre Bruno Fini asked, what do you think is the reason number one explaining the invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
So I think Putin needed something to increase his legitimacy, and he thought it would be an easy war. So that is the explanation. A lot of people would say, well, I watched Putin's speech. He sounded really sincere and emotional. He's afraid of Ukraine joining NATO. Putin is a KGB officer. When he speaks, he doesn't speak to show how sincere he is. He speaks to convince you or to believe what he wants you to believe. So that's it. And I think we should look for what he does, not what he says. And that suggests that he wanted to replay Crimea because his domestic situation is not great. So let me give you some numbers. In September, there were Duma elections, parliamentary elections. And yes, Putin's party got 70% of the seats, but they actually got 50% of the vote. And most of that is because of fraud, because the popularity in the polls was 30%. Also, when people are asked, whom do you vote for if presidential election happens today, only 30% want to vote for Putin. So this is a situation which Putin doesn't like. He needs another Crimea, but here he miscalculated. He really miscalculated, and that is going to cost him dearly.
Thank you very much. We can stay a full night and ask lots of questions, but we promise you to be free at least.
Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you very much. And well, we'll have many occasions, I think, to speak about it.
Yes,
thank you very much, Sergei.
Thank you. Thank you, Florent. Thank
Bye.
you, everybody, for an interesting question. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Merci Florent.
Merci Olivier. À bientôt.
À très vite.